She was poor, desperate, and alone. To bury her mother, a cleaner gave up everything. Then fate turned. Esteemed viewers, welcome to Luxurious True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more captivating luxurious true stories. Let's get into the story. Camila Theophilus learned very early that some houses were not built with love, but with endurance. The small, aging home she lived in sat on the edge of the city, its walls thin enough to carry every insult, every order, every sigh of disappointment directed at her. Since the death of her father years earlier, Camila had existed more like a shadow than a daughter. Her stepmother, Esther, ruled the house with a sharp tongue and colder heart, reminding Camila daily that she was not her blood. To Esther, Camila was a responsibility she never asked for, one she repaid with constant labor and cruelty. Every morning before sunrise, Camila scrubbed floors, washed clothes, prepared meals, and cleaned rooms that were never hers. While other girls her age dreamed of school, love, or freedom, Camila's dreams were quieter and humbler: peace, dignity, and a chance to rest without guilt. She worked as a cleaner during the day in offices that barely noticed her presence, then returned home to more work without pay. Esther's daughter, Fiona, lived a very different life, fashionable, admired, and protected, while Camila was treated like an inconvenience that refused to disappear. Yet despite the hardship, Camila carried a softness that life had failed to crush. She was gentle, deeply respectful, and untainted by the bitterness surrounding her. Her greatest comfort was her mother, the one person who saw her pain and still called her "my child" with warmth. At night, Camila would sit beside her mother's bed, listening to her slow breathing, holding her hand, and praying silently that life would someday change. She did not know then that the fragile piece she clung to was already slipping away, and that this house of silence would soon become the birthplace of the most painful decision of her life. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair, the kind that seeped into the skin and refused to wash away. Camila sat on a plastic chair with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the closed door in front of her as if sheer will could keep it shut forever. Her mother had been ill for weeks, growing thinner by the day, her voice weakening, her smiles fading into tired attempts at reassurance. Camila had cleaned twice as many offices, begged supervisors for advances, and skipped meals just to afford the medication, but it was never enough. Poverty was relentless, and illness showed no mercy. When the doctor finally stepped out, his face already carried the answer Camila feared. He spoke gently, professionally, explaining that her mother's heart had given out. Camila heard the words, but they didn't settle immediately. For a long moment, the world stood still. Then reality crashed into her chest with brutal force. Her knees buckled, her breath disappeared, and the grief she had been holding back tore through her in a silent scream. She walked into the room, touched her mother's cold hand, and understood, completely and finally, that she was alone. The sorrow did not end with tears. It followed her home in the form of unpaid hospital bills, burial fees, and questions she could not answer. Esther showed no sympathy. Instead, she scoffed at Camila's red eyes and trembling hands, complaining about inconvenience and money. Fiona avoided her entirely. That night, Camila lay awake on the floor beside her mother's empty bed, clutching the small pendant her mother had given her years ago. It was the only thing of value she owned, and the only thing that reminded her that love had once existed. By morning, grief would turn into panic, and panic would push her toward a choice she never imagined she would make. Grief was supposed to be met with comfort, or at least silenced, but Camila found neither waiting for her at home. The morning after her mother's death, Esther stood in the kitchen counting money with deliberate slowness, her lips pressed in irritation as Camila entered quietly. There were no words of condolence, no soft acknowledgement of loss. Instead, Esther's first sentence cut deep and sharp. asking how long Camila intended to mope around and whether she expected the household to stop functioning because of her sadness. Camila lowered her head, swallowing the ache in her throat, realizing that even mourning was a privilege she could not afford. When Camila timidly mentioned the burial, her voice shaking as she spoke of her mother's body still lying in the morgue, Esther laughed, an unkind, dismissive sound. She made it clear that there would be no financial help, no borrowed money, no sympathy. Camila was told plainly that her mother was her problem and that if she couldn't afford a burial, she should figure it out like an adult. Fiona added to the cruelty with smirks and cruel remarks, suggesting cheap solutions and mocking Camila's tears. The house that had already felt cold now became unbearable. That evening, Camila stepped outside and sat alone on the cracked front steps, staring at the fading sky. She thought about her father, gone too soon, and now her mother, her only anchor, taken from her. With no savings, no support, and time running out, fear wrapped tightly around her chest. She knew what awaited her mother's body if she failed to act. As the city lights flickered on, Camila made a silent vow to do whatever it took to give her mother a proper burial. She didn't yet know how far that vow would push her, but desperation had already begun to reshape her moral boundaries. The next few days blurred into a painful routine of rejection. Camila woke before dawn, dressed in her only decent clothes, and moved from building to building with a folded file clutched to her chest. She applied everywhere: restaurants, laundry services, offices, cleaning agencies, anywhere that might offer quick pay. Some places dismissed her before she finished speaking. Others promised to call and never did. A few looked at her worn shoes and tired eyes and decided she was invisible. By midday, her feet ached, her throat burned from repeating the same plea, and hope thinned with every closed door. Each rejection carried weight, not just for her, but for the lifeless body of her mother waiting in cold storage. The morgue fees were increasing daily, and the burial cost loomed like a deadline she could not outrun. Camila tried to borrow money, approaching distant relatives and old acquaintances, but grief had made her presence uncomfortable. Excuses replaced compassion. People avoided her calls. Some advised her to let the government handle it, as if her mother were an unclaimed stranger. Camila returned home each night exhausted, only to be reminded by Esther that time was running out and patience was thin. On the fourth evening, as rain soaked the streets and smeared city lights into long, trembling lines, Camila stood under a bus shelter and finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. Honest work would not save her in time. There was no miracle coming, no sudden kindness waiting around the corner. As she watched a group of women across the street, dressed boldly, laughing loudly, drawing the attention of passing cars, an idea formed that terrified her. It felt wrong, humiliating, irreversible. But desperation had stripped her of alternatives. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, Camila made the decision that would change the course of her life forever. That night, Camila did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the thin mattress on the floor, staring at the wall as if it might argue with her thoughts. Every memory of her mother's voice echoed in her head, soft, principled, always urging her to protect herself, to value her body and her heart. Camila pressed her palms against her ears, trying to silence the conflict raging inside her. She was a virgin not by chance, but by choice, raised with a quiet sense of dignity she had guarded fiercely. Now that dignity felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. By morning, the city moved on as if nothing had happened, buses roaring past, people rushing to work, life continuing without pause. Camila washed her face, braided her hair neatly, and put on a plain dress that hid how violently her hands were shaking. She told herself this would be a transaction, nothing more, one moment of pain to secure her mother's peace. Yet each step she took toward the unfamiliar part of the city felt heavier than the last, as if her body was resisting what her mind had already decided. As dusk approached, Camila reached the quarters she had only ever heard whispered about. Neon lights flickered weakly, laughter sounded forced, and the air was thick with smoke and desperation. Women leaned against walls, confident, practiced, detached. Camila stood apart, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would betray her fear. She did not belong there, she knew it, and so did anyone who looked closely. Still, she stayed. Because somewhere in the cold, silent morgue, her mother was waiting. And Camila had run out of time. Camila stood at the edge of the street, feeling as though she had crossed into a world that did not recognize innocence. Cars slowed as they passed, headlights sweeping over her face, lingering for a second too long before moving on. The other women watched her with curiosity, some with pity, others with quiet judgment. Camila kept her eyes low, copying their posture, forcing herself to appear calm even as fear twisted painfully in her stomach. Every instinct told her to run, yet her feet remained rooted to the pavement. Time dragged on until the sound of an expensive car pulling up broke her thoughts. The driver stepped out, Daniel Elliott. He carried himself with the casual confidence of a man used to control, his suit slightly loosened, the sharp scent of alcohol clinging to him. This was routine for him, a way to numb the stress of power and responsibility. As his eyes moved across the women, they slid past practiced smiles and bold gestures, until they stopped on Camila. She did not smile. She did not step forward. She simply stood there, tense and quiet, and somehow that stillness drew him in. When Daniel pointed at her, Camila's heart nearly stopped. The other women protested lightly, surprised by his choice, but he ignored them. As she approached, her legs felt weak, her breath shallow. She told herself not to panic, not to cry, not to ruin the only chance she had. Daniel barely spoke as they got into the car, the city lights blurring past the window as they drove away. Camila clasped her hands together tightly, silently begging herself to be strong. She did not know yet that this night would follow her forever, or that the man beside her would soon regret everything he was about to do. Daniel's house rose behind tall gates, quiet and intimidating, a place designed for solitude rather than warmth. As the car rolled into the driveway, Camila's courage thinned. She had imagined a hotel room, somewhere anonymous and temporary, but this felt permanent, heavy with the presence of a man's private life. Inside, the house smelled of expensive cologne and polished wood. Soft lights illuminated modern furniture that looked untouched, as if no one truly lived there. Daniel moved ahead of her, loosening his tie, his steps unsteady from drink and exhaustion. Camila followed slowly, her pulse loud in her ears. Every sound, the click of his shoes, the closing of a door, felt amplified. She tried to speak, to gather the right words, but fear pressed down on her chest. When they reached the bedroom, reality finally crushed whatever fragile barrier she had built around herself. Her hands trembled openly now. She could not pretend any more. This was not acting. This was her life crossing a line she could never erase. With a shaking voice, Camila told him the truth. She spoke of her mother's death, the unpaid burial, the morgue, the desperation that had driven her to the street. She told him she was a virgin, that she had never been with a man, that she was terrified. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Daniel looked at her, irritation flashing across his face, the alcohol dulling whatever empathy might have surfaced. He accused her of lying, of trying to manipulate him. When Camila pleaded, tears spilling freely, his patience snapped. He told her coldly that if she wasn't willing, she could leave, no money, no discussion. Camila stood frozen, caught between dignity and duty, between herself and her mother's unburied body. Slowly, painfully, she nodded. She chose sacrifice over pride. And in that moment, something inside her broke quietly, without drama, as she stepped forward to give away the most guarded part of herself for a farewell she could not abandon. Camila moved as though she were no longer fully inside her body, each step careful, distant, and real. The room felt too large, the bed too white, the silence too loud. Daniel turned away briefly, pouring himself another drink, muttering about a long day and bad decisions. Camila stood there, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the floor, reminding herself why she was here. She thought of her mother's still face, the unanswered bills, the cold drawer in the morgue. That image steadied her more than courage ever could. What followed was brief but devastating. There was no tenderness, no patience, only the weight of inevitability. Camila cried quietly, biting down on her pain so it would not spill into screams. The room blurred. Time slowed and then rushed all at once. When it was over, she curled inward, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. Daniel, dulled by alcohol and exhaustion, barely noticed the depth of her distress. He turned away, already retreating into sleep. Before dawn, Camila rose carefully, dressing with trembling hands. She did not wake him. She did not touch the money on the table, whether from shame, fear, or confusion, she did not know. As she slipped out, tears fell freely for the first time that night. In her haste, she left behind the small pendant her mother had given her, a simple piece, worn smooth by years of love. She didn't look back. She walked into the early morning light, broken, determined, and unaware that this forgotten token would change everything that followed. Morning light crept into the room in thin, accusing lines. Daniel woke with a pounding head and the dull taste of alcohol lingering on his tongue. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented, staring at the ceiling as fragments of the night surfaced. Camila's shaking voice, her tears, the words he had dismissed too easily. When he turned and saw the stained sheets, reality struck him hard. The red on the white fabric froze him in place. Memory sharpened instantly, slicing through the haze of drink and arrogance. She hadn't lied. She had told him the truth, and he had chosen not to hear it. He sat up slowly, guilt pressing on his chest like a physical weight. The room felt different now, smaller, heavier, filled with the echoes of what he had done. Daniel searched for her, calling out once, then again, but the house answered only with silence. That was when he noticed the pendant on the bedside table. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand, sensing its importance without knowing why. It was simple, worn, and clearly cherished. Proof that she had been real. Proof that she had trusted him with something sacred. Daniel spent the rest of the day searching. He drove back to the quarters, questioned people, offered money, descriptions, anything. No one had seen her. As hours turned into days, regret deepened into obsession. He kept the pendant with him, a quiet reminder of a choice he could not undo. For the first time in years, Daniel Elliott felt truly unsettled. And though Camila was already slipping into a life shaped by survival and silence, his search for her had only just begun. Camila returned home before the city fully woke, her body aching and her spirit numb. She washed herself carefully, as if scrubbing harder might erase the night, then dressed in silence and stepped back into the role the world expected of her. Esther noticed her absence but asked no questions, only complained about unfinished chores and wasted time. Fiona watched her with narrowed eyes, sensing something had shifted, something fragile now cracked. Camila said nothing. Words felt useless, heavy, and dangerous. Days passed with cruel efficiency. Camila went back to cleaning offices, lowering her head, moving through rooms without being seen. She gathered what little money she could, small advances, borrowed coins, overtime pay, and, combined with what she finally accepted from the table she'd left untouched in her mind, she arranged her mother's burial. The ceremony was small, quiet, and dignified. Camila stood alone at the graveside, whispering apologies into the earth, promising her mother that the sacrifice had not been in vain. When the soil finally covered the coffin, a chapter of her life closed, sealed with grief and resolve. Elsewhere, Danielle's search slowed and then stalled. Weeks turned into months. Leads dried up. Faces blurred. The pendant remained in his pocket, a constant reminder of a woman who had vanished without a trace. Eventually, the world demanded his attention again: meetings, deals, public appearances. He told himself to move on. Camila, meanwhile, learned how to survive without hope, believing the past was something best buried. Neither of them knew that their lives were quietly circling each other again, drawn by a connection neither could fully escape. Life forced itself back into Daniel Elliott's routine with ruthless efficiency. Boardrooms replaced guilt, numbers replaced memories, and public smiles covered private unrest. Months after the night he could not forget, he allowed himself to be seen again, at charity dinners, corporate launches, quiet lounges after work. It was at one of these events that he met Fiona. She was confident, sharp-tongued, and ambitious, the kind of woman who knew how to command attention. She laughed easily, spoke boldly about the life she wanted, and showed no interest in who Daniel had been before that moment, only who he was now. Their relationship unfolded quickly. Fiona admired his wealth and influence, and Daniel admired her certainty, mistaking it for strength. She introduced him to her social circle, spoke of family struggles with dramatic flair, and painted herself as a survivor who deserved more from life. Daniel listened, unaware of the half-truths woven into every story. He did not know she had a sister she never mentioned, a cleaner she treated like furniture, a house where cruelty was routine. Meanwhile, Camila continued to exist quietly in the same city, shrinking herself to avoid notice. She cleaned, cooked, obeyed, and endured. Her grief had hardened into something practical. She no longer cried, no longer hoped. When Fiona began coming home later, glowing with new confidence and gifts, Camila noticed but did not ask questions. She had learned that curiosity brought pain. Fate, however, was not finished with either of them. And the distance Daniel thought he had put between himself and his past was about to collapse in the most unexpected way. Daniel first noticed the house because it didn't match the image Fiona had painted of her life. She had spoken of struggle, yes, but also of pride, of rising above hardship. Yet when he followed her home one evening, the building was old, cramped, and worn down by neglect. The walls were cracked, the gate crooked, the yard untended. Fiona rushed ahead, suddenly defensive, her earlier confidence slipping as she fumbled with the keys. Daniel stepped inside and immediately felt an unease he couldn't explain. The smell of cleaning chemicals lingered in the air. From the corner of the living room, a young woman rose quietly from her knees, a rag still in her hand. She wore plain clothes, her hair tied back, her eyes lowered out of habit rather than shyness. For a split second, Daniel did not breathe. The room tilted. He knew that face. Thinner now, more guarded, but unmistakable. Camila. Camila froze when she recognized him. The world seemed to narrow to the sound of her own heartbeat. Fiona laughed casually, introducing her as just the maid, brushing past attention she didn't notice, or chose not to. Daniel said nothing at first. He simply watched as Fiona snapped orders at Camila, criticizing her work, her posture, her silence. Every word landed like a blow. In that moment, the past and present collided, and Daniel understood that the woman he had been searching for had never disappeared at all. She had been trapped, right here, in plain sight. Daniel stayed longer than he intended, his presence heavy in the small room. Fiona's voice grew sharper as the evening wore on, her impatience aimed squarely at Camila, criticizing dust she imagined, inventing faults, issuing orders meant to humiliate. Daniel watched closely now, no longer distracted by charm. He noticed how Camila moved, careful, practiced, bracing for impact. He noticed the way she flinched at Fiona's tone, The way Esther joined in with cutting remarks that landed without remorse. This wasn't discipline. It was cruelty, normalized. Camila kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the rhythm of work to steady herself. She did not speak to Daniel. She did not ask for recognition or mercy. That restraint struck him harder than any accusation could have. The pendant, her pendant, burned in his pocket, and the memory of that night pressed forward with unbearable clarity. He understood, then, how easily power had failed her. How often it still did. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and absolute. He corrected Fiona, once. The room fell quiet. Fiona laughed it off, trying to recover her footing, but something had shifted. Esther stiffened. Camila looked up for the briefest moment, confusion flickering across her face. Daniel said nothing more that night. He left with a promise to return, and with it, a decision already made. Whatever he had mistaken for love was over. What remained was truth, and a debt he intended to repay. Daniel did not call Fiona the next day. Instead, he sat alone in his office, replaying every moment from the house, the orders barked, the casual insults, the way Camila made herself smaller to survive. By evening, he had reached clarity. He invited Fiona to dinner, choosing a quiet place where there would be no audience to perform for. She arrived radiant and confident, already speaking about plans and expectations that no longer existed in his mind. He ended it cleanly. No explanations about incompatibility, no soft excuses. When Fiona demanded reasons, he told her the truth, that he had seen who she was when power was on her side. The charm evaporated instantly. Her voice sharpened, her pride cracked, and bitterness spilled out in accusations. Daniel stood, unmoved, and walked away without looking back. For the first time, he felt relief instead of loss. That night, Camila overheard the argument at home. Fiona returned furious, throwing objects, blaming everyone but herself. Esther joined in, turning their anger on Camila with renewed cruelty. Camila absorbed it in silence, unaware that the end of one relationship had quietly opened the door to her own escape, and to a reckoning that was drawing closer by the hour. Daniel returned to the house 2 days later, unannounced. The air was tense the moment he stepped inside. Fiona's confidence was gone, replaced by suspicion and anger, while Esther hovered nearby, calculating. Camila was scrubbing the floor when she felt his presence before she saw him. Her hands slowed. Her chest tightened. She did not look up. Experience had taught her that attention was dangerous. Daniel asked Esther to leave the room. When she protested, his tone hardened, and she obeyed. Fiona scoffed, arms crossed, demanding to know why he was there. Daniel's gaze never left Camila. He told Fiona calmly that he knew everything, that the woman she had mocked and beaten was the same woman from months ago, the one whose pain he had ignored. The room went still. Fiona's face strained of color. Camila finally looked up, shock and fear colliding in her eyes. Daniel took a breath and did something he had not done since that night. He apologized. Not loudly. Not dramatically. He apologized directly to Camila, naming his failure, owning his cruelty, and offering nothing in return except honesty. Fiona exploded, denying, accusing, twisting the story, but Daniel cut through it. He told her the relationship was over for good and that her behavior would no longer be hidden behind money or charm. When he left, the house felt smaller than ever. Fiona's rage turned violent, Esther's words turned venomous, and Camila stood in the center of it all, terrified, shaking, but no longer invisible. Something had shifted. The truth was out. And once truth is spoken, it refuses to be buried again. That night, the house erupted. Fiona's anger boiled over into open violence, her accusations sharp and relentless, blaming Camila for a future she believed had been stolen from her. Esther joined in, calling Camila ungrateful, wicked, and manipulative, insisting she had ruined everything with her silence. For the first time, Camila did not shrink. Her body trembled, but her voice did not. She spoke, quietly at first, then with strength she didn't know she possessed, telling them she had endured enough, that their cruelty had already taken too much from her. The words stunned them. Fiona raised her hand as if to strike, but Camila stepped back, standing her ground. Something in her eyes warned them this was no longer the same girl who begged and obeyed. She gathered her few belongings that night, hands steady despite the chaos, ignoring the insults thrown after her. The door closed behind her with a finality that felt like air rushing back into her lungs. Camila walked into the night with nowhere specific to go, only one certainty: she would never return. For the first time since her mother's death, fear loosened its grip just enough to make room for resolve. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew the worst was finally behind her. Camila spent the night at a small, aging shelter on the edge of the city, a place filled with quiet stories and tired hope. The bed was narrow, the walls thin, but no one shouted at her, no one demanded anything from her. For the first time in years, she slept without fear of being woken by insults. Morning arrived gently, and with it, a fragile sense of possibility. Daniel found her the next day. He had expected resistance, anger, rejection, but when he saw her sitting alone in the common room, calm and distant, his chest tightened. He spoke carefully, offering help without conditions, acknowledging that forgiveness was not owed. He told her about the pendant, returning it to her hands at last. Camila stared at it for a long moment before closing her fingers around it. Tears came quietly, not for the past, but for the understanding she had never been given. They talked for hours. Not about love, not about promises, but about survival, regret, and the weight of choices. Daniel offered her a job, a place to stay, protection, not as repayment, but his responsibility. Camila listened, measured, cautious. When she finally nodded, it was not surrender. It was a decision made on her own terms. A door had opened, not into the past, but towards something new. Camila moved into a small apartment Daniel arranged, modest, quiet, and hers alone. No shouting. No orders. No footsteps she had to anticipate. The first nights were the hardest. Silence felt unfamiliar, almost loud. She woke often, reaching for a panic that no longer came. Slowly, routines formed. She cooked simple meals, walked to work without fear, and began to reclaim hours of her life that had once belonged to survival alone. At Daniel's company, Camila worked as a cleaner again, but this time with dignity. No one yelled. No one belittled her. Daniel kept his distance, honoring the boundaries she set, watching her rebuild with a patience he had never practiced before. He saw her intelligence, her discipline, the quiet pride she carried even in exhaustion. Respect grew where guilt once lived. For Camila, healing was uneven. Some days she felt strong. Other days, memories returned without warning. Yet each time, she chose herself. She enrolled in evening classes, learned basic accounting, and discovered a love for order and systems, things she could control. For the first time, her future felt like something she was allowed to imagine. Time did what apologies could not, it softened edges. Camila and Daniel spoke more, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals navigating truth. Daniel confessed the emptiness behind his wealth, the habits he used to numb pressure, the night he learned how power could destroy. Camila listened, not to absolve him, but to understand the man who had changed. When Esther and Fiona attempted to contact Camila, pleading, threatening, then begging, Camila refused to respond. Closure, she learned, did not require conversation. Justice came quietly, boundaries, independence, and the refusal to return to harm. She visited her mother's grave often, speaking of growth instead of pain, leaving flowers bought with her own money. One evening, Daniel asked, not demanded, not assumed, if Camila would consider starting anew with him, slowly, honestly, without secrecy or imbalance. Camila did not answer immediately. She weighed her heart carefully, honoring what she had survived. When she finally agreed, it was with conditions rooted in respect. This time, the choice was hers. Their relationship unfolded without spectacle. No grand gestures, no pressure. Trust arrived in small, consistent acts, listening, patience, shared silences. Camila flourished. She rose at work, mentored others quietly, and built a life that no longer revolved around fear. Daniel changed too, shedding habits that once defined him, choosing presence over escape. On the anniversary of her mother's burial, Camila stood at the graveside with calm in her chest. She thanked her mother, not for suffering, but for strength. She wore the pendant openly now, no longer a reminder of loss, but of endurance. The past had shaped her, but it no longer owned her. In the end, love did not erase what happened, it honored it by becoming better. Camila did not trade her pain for comfort, she transformed it into power. And Daniel learned that redemption is not taken, it is earned, daily, through humility and care. Together, they stepped forward, not forgetting, but free. As this story comes to an end, remember that behind every luxury lies a truth few ever see. If this story moved you, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Until the next unforgettable true story, stay inspired and stay curious.